part-timers, we have people who are moving from out of state, people are getting a different job who need to relocate for any number of reasons, growing families, people who are moving out of apartments and need a little bit more space.
The cameras were rolling when Governor Katie Hobbs finally lost her composure. Her voice trembled, frustration spilling out as reporters pressed her about the collapsing South Arizona condo market. Prices were plummeting, projects were abandoned, and families who once dreamed of desert luxury were now drowning in debt. Behind her, the promises of endless growth had turned into silent, half-built towers baking in the sun. And as her anger broke through on live television, one question echoed across Arizona. How did the state's biggest success story become its most painful collapse? How the condo bubble rose. For years, everyone swore the South Arizona condo market was unstoppable. Tucson, Sierra Vista, and those sun-drenched communities down by the border became the new gold rush towns. Except the treasure wasn't buried underground. It was stacked sky-high in glass and stucco towers. The sales pitches sounded irresistible. Affordable desert living, endless sunshine, and profits that just kept climbing. Developers promised luxury at half the California price, and people bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. You couldn't open your social media without seeing someone bragging about their investment condo in Tucson or Yuma. It started innocently enough. Low interest rates had turned ordinary buyers into small-time moguls. Everyone wanted in on the action. People who'd never owned more than a family home were suddenly buying pre-construction units by the dozen, flipping them before the paint dried. Banks were practically begging to hand out loans, confident the market would keep climbing forever. The numbers were intoxicating. Double-digit price jumps every year, bidding wars breaking out over units that didn't even exist yet. The mood was pure mania, and in the middle of it all stood Arizona, basking in its new role as America's desert jackpot. But behind the excitement, something darker was brewing. Investors from out of state, mostly California and Washington, started treating South Arizona like a playground for quick profit. They weren't moving in, they were cashing out. You'd hear stories of investors flying in for a weekend, buying 5 condos in a single afternoon, and heading back home without ever seeing them again. These places weren't homes anymore. They were chips in a giant casino game, and everyone thought they'd figured out how to win. Locals watched in disbelief as prices shot up faster than their paychecks could ever hope to catch. A one-bedroom condo that used to sell for $180,000 was suddenly pushing $300,000. Developers rushed to keep up, pouring foundations in every patch of desert they could find. In Tucson's outskirts, massive condo complexes rose from the sand like mirages. Entire mini-cities promising golf views, pools, and modern desert luxury. Billboards lined the highways, selling a lifestyle more than a home. Realtors bragged about record closings, and buyers couldn't sign fast enough. The media fed the frenzy too. Every headline read the same: Arizona's unstoppable housing boom. The state was sold as a cheaper, sunnier alternative to California, the place where dreams were affordable. But behind those headlines, the cracks were already showing. Construction materials were getting pricier, contractors were overbooked, and maintenance costs on these new condos were ballooning. Yet no one wanted to talk about that. Everyone was too busy making money, or pretending to. By the time anyone noticed the signs, the empty units, the rising HOA fees, the stalled construction projects, the damage was already done. The South Arizona condo craze had grown too fast, too wild, and too reckless. It wasn't about homes or communities anymore. It was about cashing out before the crash. The state that once prided itself on steady growth had become addicted to the high of nonstop expansion. And like every addiction, it was only a matter of time before the crash came. Hard, loud, and messy. The cracks begin to show. At first, no one wanted to admit it. The condo market in southern Arizona still looked shiny on the surface. Fancy brochures, rooftop pools, and sold-out signs plastered on half-built developments. But behind all that glitz, the cracks were spreading fast. It started quietly, the way storms always do. A few buyers backed out of their contracts, blaming uncertain interest rates. A few units took a little longer to sell. Then suddenly, what had once been a frenzy turned into silence. Real estate agents, who had spent years juggling offers and turning away buyers, began whispering that things felt different. Condos that once sold in days were sitting on the market for months. Developers started throwing in desperate incentives: free appliances, discounted closing costs, even a year of HOA fees covered, just to get deals done. But the excitement that once fueled the market had vanished. Everyone could feel it. The magic was gone. The real culprit was hiding in plain sight: interest rates. When the Federal Reserve began hiking rates to fight inflation, it was like someone pulled the plug on Arizona's dream. Those low-interest mortgages that had fueled the buying binge evaporated overnight. Suddenly, monthly payments jumped by hundreds of dollars, and buyers who had once stretched their budgets to the limit were forced to walk away. The market's foundation, built on cheap credit and blind optimism, started to crumble. In Tucson and Sierra Vista, half-finished condo projects stood eerily quiet. Construction crews were laid off mid-project, leaving skeletal frames baking in the desert sun. Developers tried to stay upbeat in interviews, calling it a temporary slowdown. But everyone knew better. Banks grew nervous and began tightening lending standards. Investors who had once bragged about flipping 3 condos in a month were quietly unloading their properties, afraid of being the last one holding the bag. It didn't help that maintenance costs were skyrocketing. Homeowners associations were struggling to keep up with repairs and rising insurance premiums. Cracked foundations, leaky roofs, and half-built amenities started piling up on to-do lists that no one could afford to fix. Condo owners found themselves paying more for less, while property values slipped lower with each passing month. The same people who had once toasted their new desert investments were now staring at balance sheets full of red ink. The human stories were the hardest to watch. Retirees who had sunk their life savings into Arizona condos found themselves stuck with homes they couldn't sell and fees they couldn't pay. Young families who thought they'd finally made it into the housing market were forced to choose between keeping the lights on or paying their mortgages. Entire neighborhoods that had once buzzed with new energy turned quiet, windows dark and lawns unkempt. Governor Hobbs, already juggling scandals and political heat, couldn't ignore what was happening. The condo crash wasn't just an economic problem, it was a full-blown social disaster. Cities like Tucson and Yuma, which had staked their future on new development, were suddenly facing a sea of stalled projects and declining tax revenue. Contractors were out of work, small businesses were closing, and confidence, that invisible glue holding the economy together, was cracking along with the condos themselves. Governor Hobbs on the edge. The day Governor Katie Hobbs faced the press, you could feel the tension before she even spoke. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and behind that podium stood a woman clearly at her limit. Her hands gripped the edges, her voice cracked mid-sentence. The polished calm of a politician replaced by raw frustration. It wasn't just another news conference, it was a breaking point, live on air. Arizona's leader, cornered by scandal and a crumbling housing market, had finally cracked under the pressure. For weeks, Hobbs had tried to hold the line. She spoke of market corrections, economic headwinds, and policy resilience. But no amount of political phrasing could hide what was happening across South Arizona. The condo market had gone from unstoppable to unrecognizable. Entire developments were frozen in time, empty frames standing like tombstones for a dream gone wrong. Investors were pulling out, construction workers were laid off, and homeowners were drowning in debt. The air of prosperity that once defined the state had turned thick with fear. Adding fuel to the fire was the growing scandal swirling around Hobbs herself. Arizona's Attorney General had launched an investigation into her alleged ties with the operator of a group home for foster kids, a story that had already bruised her credibility. Critics pounced on the timing, calling it the perfect storm of incompetence and corruption. Talk shows ran the clip of her emotional outburst on repeat. The words barely mattered. It was her face, the trembling lip, the flash of anger, that told the story. Behind closed doors, her aides were scrambling to contain the fallout. They urged her to stay calm, to stick to the script. But Hobbs had hit a wall. Every press appearance brought another wave of angry homeowners demanding answers. They wanted to know why no one had seen the crash coming, why regulators hadn't stepped in when speculative condo flipping became the state's favorite sport, and why developers were being bailed out while ordinary people were losing everything. Her outburst wasn't staged. It was the sound of a governor who had run out of excuses. Her frustration wasn't misplaced. Arizona's entire political identity had been built on the illusion of endless growth. For decades, leaders bragged about the state's expansion, the new suburbs, the shiny developments, the jobs tied to housing. But what no one wanted to admit was how fragile it all was. The South Arizona condo market was just the first domino. Behind it came falling revenues, shrinking budgets, and the slow bleed of public confidence. Cities that had thrived on growth were suddenly facing deficits and unemployment lines. For Hobbs, this wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a political nightmare. Every problem felt personal. She had campaigned on stabilizing housing, expanding affordability, and building opportunity. Instead, she found herself leading a state watching its foundation collapse. Her anger that day wasn't only about the numbers. It was about the betrayal of an idea. The Arizona dream, that story of boundless possibility, was slipping through her fingers, and the cameras were there to capture every second of it. When her voice finally broke, the silence in the room was deafening. Some saw weakness, others saw something they hadn't seen in politics for a long time: honesty. It was a rare human moment in the middle of a crisis that had stripped away every illusion of control. The governor of Arizona had lost her composure, but maybe for the first time, she showed something real. Because in that moment, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for a state that had lost its balance, its confidence, and perhaps its faith in the dream it once sold so proudly. The fallout across South Arizona. When the governor's voice cracked on live TV, it wasn't just her composure that broke. It was the illusion that Arizona's boom could survive anything. Within hours, her outburst was replayed across every news channel, dissected in podcasts, and turned into political ammunition. But while commentators debated whether Hobbs had shown weakness or humanity, South Arizona was living through the consequences she couldn't control. Condo prices were in free fall, and the glittering towers that had once symbolized prosperity were turning into monuments of overconfidence. In Tucson, real estate offices that once buzzed with calls were silent. Agents stared at listings that refused to move. The phone didn't ring, except for clients asking how far prices might drop. Entire developments, once sold out before they were even finished, sat dark at night. Units empty, lights off, lawns starting to fade in the desert heat. Those who had bought during the peak were stuck, unable to sell without losing a fortune. Others, fearing the market would crash further, began walking away altogether, leaving behind a trail of foreclosure notices and abandoned condos. Local businesses felt the shock next. Contractors and construction crews, once Arizona's pride, found themselves out of work overnight. Furniture stores, landscapers, and interior designers all saw their sales evaporate. Restaurants that had relied on new residents and bustling developments stood half empty. Even the small service businesses, cleaners, maintenance crews, delivery drivers, were hit hard. The condo crash wasn't confined to real estate anymore. It was spreading like a virus through the local economy. City governments began panicking as property tax revenues dried up. In Tucson, budget shortfalls forced delays on infrastructure projects. Road repairs, school expansions, even fire department upgrades were suddenly under review. Yuma and Nogales faced similar crises. All those shiny new condos had been baked into their economic forecasts. Now, without that expected growth, their plans were crumbling. South Arizona, once the state's fastest-growing region, was shifting into survival mode. Meanwhile, the banks grew nervous. Mortgage lenders started calling in loans early or tightening new applications. Credit for small developers vanished, and projects already underway were abandoned midstream. The financial institutions that had once bragged about fueling Arizona's future began quietly withdrawing their exposure. Confidence, that invisible currency that keeps markets alive, vanished almost overnight. The phrase condo glut became the new buzzword, but the real devastation was emotional. You could feel it in the voices of homeowners being interviewed on local radio. One retired couple in Sierra Vista said they'd spent their life savings on a pre-construction condo that would pay for itself. Now the builder had gone bankrupt, and they were left with nothing. A young nurse from Tucson told reporters she had to move back in with her parents after losing her condo to foreclosure. The dream of desert living, wide skies, palm trees, a piece of sunshine to call your own, had turned sour. And through it all, Governor Hobbs became the lightning rod for everyone's anger. Protesters showed up outside the state capitol with signs that read, "Hobbs failed homeowners, and where's the plan?" Her political opponents seized on every headline, accusing her of incompetence, corruption, and indifference. Even her allies grew distant, quietly admitting that the housing collapse had shattered the state's confidence in her leadership. But beyond the politics and the finger-pointing, there was something deeper happening, a reckoning with Arizona's identity. The South Arizona condo market had been a symbol of everything the state believed about itself: growth, prosperity, and promise. Its collapse was more than financial. It was cultural. For the first time in decades, Arizonans were being forced to ask a painful question. What happens when the dream of endless expansion finally runs out of road? In the aftermath of the governor's breakdown, that question hung over every town, every abandoned development, every darkened window in those silent condo towers. The crash had stripped away the glamour, leaving behind a hard truth. The boom was built on sand, and the desert had reclaimed what was never meant to last. When the dream turns to dust, the fallout from the South Arizona condo collapse didn't stop with lost money. It bled into every part of life. The dream that had drawn thousands to the desert was starting to look like a cruel joke. Those sleek condo ads that once promised affordable luxury living now felt like taunts. Developers had vanished, investors had fled, and families who thought they'd built a future here were left staring at foreclosure papers. The sun still blazed over Tucson and Sierra Vista, but beneath that blue sky, the mood had turned cold. You could see the damage in the details. Rows of unfinished condos, their concrete shells collecting dust, swimming pools left half dug, construction tape fluttering in the wind, HOA boards fighting over who would pay for crumbling walls and broken elevators. A once proud skyline of new builds now stood quiet, like a ghost town dressed in modern architecture. The desert, always patient, had begun to reclaim what man had overreached to claim too fast. Governor Hobbs, meanwhile, had become the face of the disaster, whether she liked it or not. Every newspaper headline painted her as either the overwhelmed leader who lost control or the rare politician who finally showed emotion in the face of catastrophe. Her outburst had split public opinion right down the middle. Some called it weakness, others said it was honesty, a human crack in the polished armor of politics. But what everyone agreed on was this: Arizona's confidence was gone, and its leadership looked shaken to the core. Behind the scenes, the state government scrambled to stop the bleeding. Emergency task forces were set up. Hobbs promised stability measures to support homeowners and curb speculative buying. But it was like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. The housing sector had been too deeply tied to Arizona's identity. Real estate wasn't just an industry here. It was a belief system. Everyone from retirees to first-time buyers had been taught that property in Arizona was a sure bet. When that myth shattered, it didn't just hurt wallets, it cracked the collective psyche. In towns like Green Valley and Sahuarita, you could feel the anxiety seeping into everyday life. Local coffee shops, once filled with talk about new developments, were now echoing with rumors of layoffs and bank repossessions. People spoke in hushed tones about friends who'd lost everything, or about those who'd simply packed up and left the state altogether. The exodus had begun. Families who had moved from California for a fresh start were heading right back, calling Arizona too risky. The flow of newcomers that had fueled the boom had reversed, leaving behind silence and for sale signs that refused to come down. And while the economy faltered, the blame game turned vicious. Political rivals accused Hobbs of ignoring early warning signs. Developers blamed rising interest rates. Banks blamed federal policy. Everyday Arizonans blamed everyone. The state that had once united around growth was splintering under the pressure. Even the media turned brutal, calling it Arizona's great unraveling. Through it all, Hobbs seemed smaller, not in stature, but in spirit. The woman who had once projected calm authority now carried the weight of a broken promise. Every public appearance became a reminder of the moment she lost her composure. The image replayed endlessly on screens and in minds. But maybe that's why it stuck. Because in that single moment, her frustration mirrored the exhaustion of an entire state. The South Arizona condo crash wasn't just a housing story. It was the story of overconfidence, of greed, of ignoring limits until they finally bite back. Arizona had built its future on the illusion that the good times would never end. But when the dust settled, literally and figuratively, the truth became impossible to deny. Growth had turned to greed, prosperity to panic, and the dream that once shimmered in the desert heat had turned to dust. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.